All right. Um, so, yeah, so what I'd love to do is talk a little bit about Terri's stages model by first just placing her model in a larger context. Um, Terri's model is focused on um, the self-reflecting mind, which for the most part, really we're talking about the human world. Of course, there are some animals that have some early self-reflection or some mystery around how much self-reflection there is. But really, Terri's model is looking at the human world and how um, a human being's sense of self-reflectivity is unfolding and growing in all these sort of multitude of ways. But prior to that, it doesn't just start with humans, it's coming from somewhere. And, as a model that's recognizing development, is recognizing that there's an evolution of consciousness, it's sort of situated within the context of the whole unfolding cosmos, meaning that even though this isn't foregrounded in the model, because we're often focused on what stage is this about and what stage and this stage, there is a recognition that first there was, a whole domain of matter where there's sort of these interacting societies of something um, that then after, billions of years eventually burst into life. But this was a continuity. It wasn't like matter, stop, life, stop.
Mhm.
It's an ongoing stream. And then after another very long period of time, the human self-reflective mind started to emerge on the scene. And so even though Terri's model is looking at stages, which can be cut up like ladder steps, my sense in what I've learned from her and also in my sort of own orientation to what makes a developmental model useful and what makes a developmental model potentially harmful. I like to hold this model as a continuity and also as a whole. One, as a part of the whole cosmos. We're not separate from nature. We're not separate from the foundation of the cosmos in terms of matter. But then also, once we're inside the domain of the stages, they're not just these discrete entities. They're more like waves that are part of a larger human masterpiece.
Mhm.
And so that as we're looking at these stages, they're all interdependent with one another. And I find that that helps me soften a little bit around some of the common orientations to developmental models. What stage am I at? What stage are you at? Am I higher than you? Are you lower? What about those lower stages? Oh, they all voted the wrong way. We get into all these kinds of conversations that stem out of some fundamental assumptions around what development is, which usually involves some sort of a linear trajectory and stairs or rungs of a ladder. And it's not that
Mhm.
there's anything wrong with that. It's just, I think that situating a developmental model within the context of wholeness, it offers some more room for developmental compassion um, and some other things that might really help it become a useful tool in our communities. So I'll just pause there, see if there's any questions that you have or comments that you want to bring.
That part's, yeah, very coincident with my
Yeah.
kind of approach to showing up on this call. So, yeah, it seems like there's the beings that start to think that rungs on a ladder are better than other rungs on a ladder, and that's where conflict emerges. But it's just the metaphor of like the flower opening. It's not like the open flower is better than the seed that
Right.
gave birth to it. So,
Yeah. And the other thing too is it's one of these funny things because as soon as we start mentioning this, it also includes that for certain stages to think in those terms is not all of that surprising. And so there's this way in which it's like I can say this thing that I'm saying while also wanting to be careful not to then say, oh, and everyone else that thinks about it more like a ladders, well, you're lower, right? Because then we end up doing the same thing. And so it's just as you were mentioning what you were saying, it was reminding me of that, that it's like, and certain stages tend to rank things.
Hmm.
And in the right context, we'll rank things along a sort of linear-ish trajectory. And so how do we embrace that as a developmental sort of something that we can expect may happen, and then also offer some conversation around it to support um, just we're continuing to sort of broaden and soften and open around these things. So
Hmm.
what I'd love to do now is dive into the model a little bit and introduce it. Um, there's this, fundamental question that we ask as human beings: what is real? This is sort of the basic ontological question. What exists? What is reality? And I'm going to pull up a slide here um,
Hmm.
to just offer some visual. Um, so when we're asking this question, what is reality? Essentially, in Terry's stages model, this is an exploration of what we might call the three tiers within the human world. And each of these tiers is a world space. Each of these tiers is an arena within which a certain types of responses to what is real tend to arise. So we have the first tier is the concrete tier. This is a tier where the answer to the question, what exists, it starts with very concrete things. Uh,
Hmm.
anything that we can see with our senses, an apple, a fridge, um, as this, the moon, the sun, dirt, blankets, mommy, person, dog. And then as the concrete tier starts to develop, um, we might start to notice things like friendship, which is still placed within the concrete tier. It's still considered a concrete object within the concrete world space, but it's a little bit more complex.
Hmm.
This includes rules and roles, belief structures, sort of the sense that, well, I know the way reality is, I know the truth, I know the true purpose of human life, all these kinds of things. So within the concrete tier, we have everything from just beginning to sense fabric on our skin all the way to, you know, a sort of fixed black and white sense of what is true and what is false.
Hmm.
So I'll just pause there, see if there's anything that comes up for you so far.
Yeah, and it seems like also the things that we might otherwise consider subtle, like sadness, is still a concrete object here. It's like in the naive use of the word concrete subtle, it's like you get more and more subtle in the concrete world,
That's
but
right.
it's not yet jumped to the subtle world.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. So, right. So, one of the common sort of things that can come up for people is like, oh, well, the concrete, that must mean I have to be able to see it with my concrete senses, like it's an apple. But there are concrete interiors.
Hmm.
And concrete interiors can include these sort of very basic emotions. They are the ground of a human emotional experience. It's like if we start talking about something that is more in the subtle tier, like vulnerability, we can't get to vulnerability without first knowing, oh, I feel happy, I feel sad, I feel scared.
Mm.
And so we can think about, just as the world of matter is the sort of the foundation of the whole cosmos, this concrete tier is the foundation of the human self-reflective mind. So that includes both in a tangible way, We need to know what apples and chairs are and sort of basic things so that you and I can sit here and have a conversation that's not about any of those things. We
Right.
need those things to help us like land on planet Earth.
Right. Right.
Then there's
What
also
would vulnerability be without knowing what an apple is? Like, how would you possibly understand it?
right. So it's right. It's like it's the ground. And then there's also the intangible concrete. So for instance, we'll see that with like a 2-year old, 3-year old, that sort of age, they begin to take the concrete world inside through visualization. So they can own it. They can see the cookie. They can see the apple. And so it's still concrete. They're not talking about some sort of effervescent luminosity that's like gracing their soul with, bliss fire, right? It's still an apple, but now
Hmm.
they can see the apple or they can imagine the beach. And so all of those concrete territories will also start to arise on the interior as well as the exterior and include our emotions and also different ways of thinking and reasoning that are not yet considered quote unquote subtle.
Okay.
Yeah.
And just so I understand, it seems like both sadness is a concrete interior and something like visualization is a concrete interior.
Yep.
And does
Hmm.
that mean something like friendship is a concrete exterior?
Yeah. Hmm.
Okay. Okay.
But but belonging, which to be clear, a 7-year old's probably not going to use that word belonging, which is going to be more of a subtle word, but there will be some interior sense of I belong to the group. I don't belong to the group. I'm alone. Nobody likes me. It'll be more language like that. My friends don't like
Hmm.
me anymore. Instead of, but we could look from a subtle vantage point and say, oh, you are concerned with belonging or not belonging.
Okay.
And that has a external aspect in terms of, who's playing together at the playground and who's sitting by themselves. Um, an 8-year-old will notice that, whereas a
Right.
two-year-old won't.
Right.
Then there's also the interior experience of no one likes me, everyone hates me. Yeah.
Okay.
Of course, then that includes as the concrete interior emotions develop, this can start to include things like shame. Because now, like I remember my daughter, it's like it wasn't until first or second grade that the word embarrassed started coming up in the kids.
Hmm. Hmm.
Like now they know someone can see them. Anyway, we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but it starts to get more nuanced and more
Yeah.
emotions
Yeah.
will arise beyond angry and happy.
Right.
Um,
Once there's those are the grammar out of which the whole poetry of emotion comes from.
you got it. Exactly. So this is the concrete tier. Um, and the first question in Terry's model is, what objects are in someone's awareness? This is a beautiful way, and from the context of recognizing stages, this is a beautiful way to begin because there's only three tiers with 12 stages. So when
Right.
you can narrow something down to one tier, you've already narrowed down your recognition question, your capacity for recognition from 12 to 4, which is
Hmm.
really, really great.
Right. Right.
As a coach, as a leader, as someone who on the spot is trying to understand someone. So with that said, the next tier is the subtle tier. This arises out of the concrete. Just as life arises out of matter, the subtle human world space is going to arise out of the concrete human world space. Now things start to change where there's new objects. We have the ability to discover a self that isn't really 100% the same as our concrete group's beliefs. You can think about it like uh, stereotypically, and there's lots of high school students that move into the subtle before they go to college. So we have to just take that into
Hmm.
account. But just as sort of a stereotypical or a archetypal image, we could say like when a kid is leaving home and going to college, all of a sudden now there's room for having their own thoughts and feelings. And they're around teachers that are provoking them to think about new things. And it's not just about what our community believed, but something new
Hmm.
can emerge. Now, In the subtle, we can start to envision a future that hasn't appeared yet. Whereas in the concrete, as Terri says, we put the past in front of us. I want to be a firefighter when I grow up. They're not
Hmm,
actually projecting into a future that doesn't exist yet. They're taking the past and
interesting.
putting it in front of them, right? And so here we
Oh, cool.
visioning, we have mutual understanding, we have the ability to understand contexts, we have the ability to have a understanding of interior parts of the self. Earlier stages than the subtle can do parts work if they are invited to by a therapist who knows or a coach who knows how to work with kids and parts. But
Mhm.
if you ask them what is that part, you're going to get very concrete answers, and they're not going to come up with a whole understanding of a part as one internal context of my being. And then another part is this whole other internal context with emotions and perspectives and impulses, and it's much more nuanced. All of those things I'm describing, from the emerging subtle self, what do I believe as separate from my the structure of my community and their beliefs and rules and roles, all the way up to this sort of nuanced understanding of parts of the self, to an understanding of uh, contexts grow along an evolutionary continuum. All of those things for now, rather, we don't need to get too caught on the details of all that stuff, but all of those things are subtle objects that are arising within this subtle world space. Anything there?
Yeah, I guess a question about is there some kind of like definitional line that distinguishes concrete and subtle? Because I can imagine like one potential draft would be like the the dynamic nature of things, the fact of the things like changing and having evolution, like maybe that maps in some way. But is there some kind of like this is the clear line where concrete becomes subtle in this model?
Well, yes, there is a clear line, and that clear line will be in this transition from the last stage of the concrete tier and the first stage of the subtle tier. Usually, those tier transitions are going to be a lot of shifting back and forth,
Mhm.
where it's not all that clear. And then in time, it starts to become clearer and clearer as to what is this new world that's beginning to arise. And I think answering your question will become clearer too as we get into the other two columns. Uh,
Okay,
but yeah, there is a clear line, but it's not like concrete hard stop, subtle hard start.
sure, sure.
It's a flowing whole where it's ambiguous in that transition, but then as the subtle tier sort of develops, um, it becomes pretty clear. Like, for example, um, my friends are mad at me versus, well, my friend told me that she was mad at me. And I noticed that that brought up a pattern of sadness in me, which reminds me about my childhood when my mother used to interact with me in a certain way, and it would bring up that same sense of non-belonging. So the first sentence, my friends are mad at me, that's concrete. The
Yeah.
second sentence was subtle. And so you can see there's a very different, very clear differentiation. There's what I described, there's metacognition, there is a capacity for pattern recognition, something that the concrete tier won't have in the same way.
Okay. I guess one other way to try to like
Yeah,
nitpick at it is, for my understanding, is like, what is the simplest thing that can no longer be considered concrete? Like, what's
yeah,
the prototypical subtle object?
yeah. So one way to answer this is the prototypical subtle object is a new identity.
Okay.
It's a new identity that is not based on the concrete world and the concrete senses. And that
Beautiful.
new
Okay.
identity is going to have its own new lenses that are going to begin to discover all of these objects, which is what this first question is curious about. Yeah.
Okay. Great.
Now, then there's a third tier. This is the metaware tier. And again, this is an entire world space. And within that world space, there are a whole new set of objects. I won't spend too much time here for now, but just to give a flavor of it, there's a recognition that everything that came before, including that subtle sense of identity, is a construct,
Hmm.
not a social construct, but an individual construct. This also can include uh, a recognition that um, these constructs are, once there's a recognition that there are these constructs, at some point I can begin playing with the boundaries of the constructs, which means you may start to see sort of a cross paradigmatic interweaving between multiple traditions. So some people in a certain place in the metaware, they'll start drawing on like, 6 different traditions, 7 different traditions, and they'll begin blending the boundaries. And they'll say, oh, well, this fits over here and this fits over here. And they become a weaving, winding, rolling, unfolding, uh, uh, individual sort of uh, current of the cosmos.
Hmm.
Now, I said what I just said on purpose to try to emulate a little bit of what that particular stage sounds like. There's sort of like the sentences roll into the next sentences, and there's like 5 million commas, and like everything builds on everything else. And it's all very, and by the end of the sentence, you don't know what they were really talking about. So I didn't really say
Uh-huh.
it, right? Right. The cross paradigmatic interweaving of like the multidimensionality of the,
Yeah.
right. And you're like, what is this person talking about? That's an example, one example of some metaware-like objects. But then we also get into a place where the sort of the great states of the great traditions start to converge. You can
Hmm.
have these great states much earlier, and many people do. But what starts to happen later in the metaware is uh, the growing of the evolving identity starts to become aligned with the whole cosmos,
Hmm.
while at the same time, these great states come online, like timelessness and boundlessness. Now, you can contact timelessness and boundlessness with practices, but let's just imagine just an imaginal scenario where someone never meditated. Once they entered into the late metaware, those states are going to start coming online anyway.
Hmm.
And I've met people who have gone into the later metaware without any, they're not interested in integral, or they don't know about integral. They don't have the language. They're not taking meditation courses every week, but you can feel it in their presence. And when you talk to them, they may not have as many words because it hasn't been handed to them.
Right.
Nonetheless, it's there. So all that to say, I don't want to spend too much time on metaware objects for now, even though it can be exciting. I want to
Sure.
really just sort of hold this as, this is the first question.
Yep.
What objects are they able to see? It may not be the objects they're talking about, but if we can get to the bottom of what objects can they see, this helps us narrow down which of the 4 stages are they sort of orienting in. So that's the
Yep.
first aspect of the model.
Great.
Now, the second aspect of the model is this question of, do they preference individual or collective? Now, one of the things that Terri has done with the stages model is tried to really integrate Ken Wilber's some of the gifts of Ken Wilber's integral theory. You see some of it on paper like this, but it's really what I found is when you get into learning all of the nuances of the scoring, how you actually assess a sentence stem to understand the stages, that's really where it's so clear how much of integral theory has been woven into this model.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have one of these primordial polarities. What does it mean to be an individual? What does it mean to be an individual in a collective? And in order to come to terms with that sort of fundamental human tension, that's of course uh, building upon billions of years of matter being individuals creating collectives, and life being individuals and creating collectives, we finally now have a self-reflective tension around it that we're trying to sort out. And so in order to care for that, the stages will fluctuate through individual preferencing. So we learn about that. What does it mean to be an individual in the concrete? What does it mean to be an individual in the collective? In the concrete
You
collective?
mean the subtle? Okay. Concrete. Okay,
Yeah.
got it.
So
Okay.
what is it?
Individual in concrete collective. Yes.
What does it mean to be an individual in the concrete world? What does it mean to be a collective identity? What does it mean to be part of a collective in the concrete world? What does it mean to be an individual in a subtle world? What does it mean to be a collective or a part of a collective in a subtle world, and so on? And so, what we'll see from a recognizing perspective is that this next question will narrow our 4 stages down to 2.
Mhm.
Say, okay, well, what objects are they aware of? Well, it seems like they're aware of subtle objects. Well, do they seem to be more foregrounding individuality and autonomy, or do they seem to be more interested in collective interaction? As soon as we've done that, we've now narrowed our 4 stages. So we narrowed it down from 12 to 4. Now we narrow it down from 4 to 2, if we're looking
Mhm.
for the primary center of gravity stage that they're coming from.
Sure, sure. And is it equivalent? Like, I heard you switch language a couple times where it's like it goes from an individual, say concrete or subtle or whatever. It's like primarily an individual perspective or a collective perspective. And then you also said, or being part of a collective. Like, I
Yeah.
hear those a little bit differently because the part of a collective still feels like individual is a little foregrounded. And I
Yeah.
wonder,
So
like, yeah.
exactly. So it's going to depend on, for example, I could come from an individual's perspective and say, I'm going to manage my team and we're going to set a goal and we're going to reach that goal. But I am managing a collective. On the other hand, I might say, well, I'm a part of a collective and I want to hear everybody's voice and I want to arrive at consensus. And so instead of me being the one that's telling you where we're headed and then getting you jazzed up so that we can all get there together, I'm actually more interested in this case, what I'm describing is a
Mhm.
reciprocal relationship with everybody's cares, thoughts, feelings, points of wisdom. And so I'm part of a collective, but I'm also starting to take on the identity of us
Yeah, yeah,
rather than me managing you guys as a group or a team.
yeah. Okay.
Okay. So
So
that's
there
our,
isn't, when the collective comes to the foreground, there isn't a negation of the individual or the part. It's right there. It's just that my lens is seeing the primacy of that individual is that it is part of the collective instead of that it is the thing that happens to be around other people.
exactly, exactly. Because as soon
Okay.
as you become, uh, for example, around like 8 or 9 or 10, you become more collective oriented. You don't lose. This is the thing about this model that I love is that when let's say if I'm looking at here's the first stage of the concrete, the second stage, the third stage, and the fourth stage. If I'm in the third stage of the concrete, I bring with me the other 2.
Yeah. Okay.
Everything I developed there, including my sense of my individual identity in that case as a body, I bring it with me.
All right. It doesn't get diminished. It's just that the other perspective grows and this now is seen as part of a larger whole.
I think of it as, yeah, more like it foregrounds, but it's not diminishing the other stuff. And that's only in one moment. So I
Right.
might be foregrounding friendship until someone steps on my toe or steals my doll. And then I
Hmm.
might go into an earlier stage and, hit them. Yeah.
Yep. Understood.
Cool. So now we have the third aspect of the model. Now, from the perspective of recognizing, it's useful to go in this order because it helps us narrow it down. From another perspective, this right side of the stages model to me is the most important.
Hmm.
And that everything else comes from this is another way to look at it. So from the perspective of how do we use the model, it's helpful to go from question 1 to question 2, question 3. But when we're looking at it from the perspective of how to understand this model, for me personally, I find that this right-hand column is the most important. We can look at
Hmm.
this as evolution's engine.
Okay.
We can look at this as um, one great gesture or one great evolutionary impulse that is has been present since at least the Big Bang. If we look at the yin yang symbol, this is the yin yang symbol. Receptive is yin, active is yang, reciprocal is the squiggly line in between, the relationship between yin and yang, and interpenetrative are the dots. I can be over, the dot shows that, well, I'm in yang, but I can look over there and I can see yang in yin. I see myself in yin in the other side of the polarity. And then I can go over to the other side and I can look and see myself over there too. Okay. Now, of course, Terri came to this from a research perspective where
Hmm.
she was analyzing, sentence stems after sentence stems after sentence stems, looking for patterns. So she found this from a researcher's perspective. But for me, as a Chinese medicine practitioner and someone who's really interested in Eastern wisdom, it was also delightful to see that she discovered a very primordial movement. Maybe we could say one of like the most fundamental movements once things
Hmm.
start moving.
Hmm. Right.
Okay. So what we'll see is that now we've got in the concrete tier. So we've got the question one, well, what objects can they see? Then the next question is, well, are they foregrounding the individual or are they foregrounding the collective? That gets us down to two. And then now we have our final question. So what is their preferred relationship to process or to learning? Um, Another way to say it is um, when we're in the presence of someone, are they foregrounding the receptive parameter or are they foregrounding the active parameter? Are they foregrounding the reciprocal or are they foregrounding the interpenetrative? Now, what I'll do is give an example because if this is the first time that someone's hearing this, that could sound really abstract. So I just want to connect it to
Yeah.
human. So if we look at a newborn, they are in the concrete world space. They can see concrete objects, hardly. They're just
Hmm.
starting to learn. There's an individual. They don't have a collective yet that they're aware of, and they're receptive. So little babies, they are drinking in the world. Even like a year old, yeah, I can imagine a year old just standing in a playground and they, use that thing they do where they just sit there and they just like they look zoned out, but I actually think that they're absorbing a lot of the
Hmm.
time,
Yeah.
right?
Purely.
Because
Yeah.
exactly. It's like it's not like, oh, that kid is typically zoned out. It's like a common thing I've seen in like 1 year olds. Like they can stand and then they're just like, so that's
Yeah, and it has the tone of wonder and awe more than it has of being, in front of a TV like zoned out. It's
that's it. Exactly.
very
Exactly.
awake.
Now let's compare this with the next stage. Now all of the parameters stay the same except for one. They're in the concrete, still individual, but now it's more active. This is like a 2 year old or a 3 year old. Mine, give me my cookie. So they're taking what they learned from everything they absorbed, and now they're getting active with it. Their process orientation changes. Now I want to steal the cookie. I want to grab things. I want to hit things. I want to move in a different way.
Mhm.
Now, we then move to the third stage, concrete, but now we have a two parameter shift. The collective comes online, which means now
Mhm.
I can see from another person's perspective in a very basic way. I at least understand that they are having different thoughts and feelings than me. It's like my daughter giving the example we were driving in a car and she goes, Daddy, everybody else in the car that's driving are having their own thoughts. And she goes like, right? And then we see this final parameter becomes reciprocal. So now there's more interest in friendship, trading. Instead of me stealing your doll, I'm going to say, well, why don't I give you my doll in exchange for your doll?
Mhm.
Finally, we have this fourth stage, which again, there's only a one parameter shift. It's concrete, that stays the same. Collective stays the same. But now interpenetration starts to happen. One way to think of this is like two clouds passing through each other. In the concrete world, this starts to look like what you believe and what I believe are the same. We'll see this a lot in like spiritual collectives or religious collectives, where everybody sort of starts talking the same.
Mm.
Everybody starts believing the same things. Everybody reads the same books. Everybody has a fairly similar interpretation around those books. So what you start to see is that in the concrete world, now things are starting to interpenetrate and it's becoming a one thing. So we have receptive begins, then active, then receptive and active start interacting together. I give something to you, you receive it. You give something to me, I receive it. And then at some point, that back and forth leads to a kind of a stabilizing where I
Mhm.
realize we're the same. My identity and the identity of the collective, and your identity and the identity of the collective, it's fairly it's pretty much the same.
Mhm.
So I'm not going to go through an example for every single stage for now, but the basic idea is to see that now that we have our map, we'll see that within the concrete world, this receptive, active, reciprocal, interpenetrative is a way for this one single gesture that's been evolving over the last 13.8 billion years is taking its first stab at moving through the human mind, the human world of self-reflectivity.
Mhm.
And in order for it to achieve some degree of fruition, it needs to go through these four stages. By the time a person gets to the fourth stage of that concrete tier, there's a certain degree of sovereignty in that
Mhm.
world.
Mhm.
They've arrived. And then there's transition, which is another important gesture that's a part of this model. As with any evolutionary model, everything is always in motion and always in transition. So then we have a transition to the next tier. And then what will repeat is everything else, but what's different are the objects.
Mhm.
And so,
And would you say there's, oh, go ahead, sorry.
no, no, go ahead, go ahead.
Would you say that, you said there's kind of like a stability and a resting spot. Would you say that in between these, these two kind of gaps in this diagram are bigger gaps, or there's more stability when I land at the interpenetrative before I embark on the next thing? Or are they all kind of equidistant from one another?
Well, what you often see, and this is of course going to be humans, like individual specific, but generally one of the patterns that we see is that when you move from one tier to the next, this is fairly volatile.
Mhm. Mhm.
Now, when you move from because your whole identity that was so certain is now breaking to pieces. And
Yeah, and all the other ones are kind of like fortifying that kind of identity within that paradigm.
right. And just like a baby, they don't have an identity really yet. It's starting to form, but it's not named, it's unknown. That same thing is going to happen at the beginning of each tier.
Yeah.
Now, the only difference is between the concrete and the subtle, we have colleges and many, 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 many adults that know about this transition, even if it's just intuitively. When you look at this transition from the subtle to the metaware, there's less
Mm.
automatic places where people are cared for in that transition. So this can be a really important place for coaches and leaders and therapists, um, because if you can spot this, you can help normalize it, and it really helps a lot.
Yeah.
Um, so one final thing I wanted to just mention in
Hmm.
introducing this model is that we have the way that we describe what the name of the stage is. And we do that by this recognition of a person perspective. So a person perspective is a fundamental, like, so we could say that of the 8 or so billion people on the earth, there's a lot of perspectives, but we find that those perspectives can be nested within these sort of larger perspectival categories.
Hmm.
We can call that a person perspective. So we'll see here 1.0 and 1.5 is the emergence 1.0 and the maturation 1.5 of the first person perspective. I'm only able to see me. 2.0 and 2.5 are going to be the emergence of 2.0 and the maturation of 2.5, the second person perspective. My ability to realize that, oh, you're sad, and I've felt sad before, and I can know that I'm not sad right now, but I can look at your face and see that you're sad. I can recognize that. Then the next, third person perspective, I can, as an example, I can now see that you and your friend are having a conversation. I'm the third person observing what's happening objectively. I see that your heart rate quickens and you lean back, but then you seem to soften your shoulders and you lean in, and I can write down all of that stuff objectively. So 3.0 is going to be the emerging third person perspective, 3.5, the maturation of the third person perspective. Then we have the fourth person perspective, who can see me, who feels like I am finding objective truth. The fourth person perspective can look at me, observing both of you, and they can say, yeah, but you're in a context. You grew up in Jersey, and your parents were like recovering beatniks, and they were intellectual Jews, and they were artists, and they were poets, and they were philosophers. So then they can say, well, okay, Alexander, I see that you think you're being objective, but I can see that you're now nested in a context that's shaping you, right? So that's the fourth person. Then the fifth person perspective can stand outside of all of that, and they can look at the fourth person perspective and say, yeah, well, I see that you're aware of contexts, but all that stuff is individually constructed. It's all made up. And then the sixth person perspective can stand outside of all of it and say, yes, and you're all one unfolding of a humanity that is a one unfolding of an entire cosmos that is completely interdependent and interconnected. And so they start talking about and seeing these larger wholes, which begins to have some sort of sprinkling ins of non-duality in the context of all of the evolutionary objects that have unfolded, which is not just having a non-dual experience with a tulip. You're having a non-dual experience with all of the perspectives and all of the objects that have grown up through all of these tiers. See all of that as one whole. So I'll stop the share there. That's sort of an overview of the model in a sort of simple way, hopefully. And I just wonder if it brings up any other curiosities for you.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for taking the time to run through it. It does. I have some curiosities kind of within the scope of what you've talked about, and then some curiosities beyond the scope. So let me start with the in the scope, just since
Yeah.
that's um, this receptive, active, reciprocal, interpenetrative. Like I still find the hardest place for me to have clarity around is the reciprocal to interpenetrative. It seems like the other ones are a little easier to define, and I'm wondering, when you were discussing the concrete tiers, you were discussing that's my cookie now, but now I want to trade as reciprocal. What's the concrete version of that turning into interpenetrative?
Yeah. Eating cookies are the only true way to awakening. And so you and I need to now create a Bible around how the cookie is the ultimate. And we both believe in that truth wholeheartedly. And then now let's come up with 5 principles. You don't steal cookies from your friends. Cookies only remain on altars that are painted yellow.
Mm-hmm.
So now what we start to do is we start to get into a system, a concrete system of principles that have clear hierarchy, clear right and wrong, And the interpenetrative part is it's both the same for you and for me.
Okay.
If we decide that cookies have to be on an altar that is yellow, you don't think that it should be on an altar that's blue
Mm,
because
okay.
it says it in the Exalted Cookie Book. I'm being silly.
No, I love it. I love it.
It's also a way not to single out a specific religion, you know,
Sure.
but that's the interpenetrative.
I'm also hearing inside that, like, that it takes something, in terms of like we learn things consciously and then they become unconscious knowledge. I hear this as like an embedding like that. Like the
Yeah.
reciprocity is now embedded in our
Yes,
principles.
that's
It's
right.
not having to be conscious anymore. It's like it's just there.
Right. And to the yes, and we still are going to do it. It's like right now I'm actively using my senses, something that I developed in 1.5, right?
Uh-huh.
And so yes, it's all embedded as we go. That's why it's not really rungs of a ladder from the perspective that I'm in,
Yeah, it's
but it's really like one fabric.
yeah, it
Um,
feels almost like spheres of access,
yep.
wider and wider access to what's actually happening.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Um, yeah, my only other question, I know that we want to keep this as a well-contained thing, is like, is 6.5 the end of the scope? Can you just speak to the ongoing
Sure.
evolution?
No, 6.5 wouldn't be the end, but 6.5 is the current place where Terry has found enough research patterns to say,
To
yes, the
announce?
patterns repeat themselves. Once we get after 6.5, yes, there are some inklings that there is indeed something after.
Mhm.
But in order to see a credible pattern from a research view, and I'm trying to hold that in my
Yeah,
answer here. We
yeah,
can speculate and have all kinds of amazing ideas about what could be. But the one thing I like about Terry's model is that it's coming from real people's words. So whereas someone like me might write fluidly about my experience and extrapolation of these different stages, and that has its place. Terry's model is coming from analyzing thousands of people's actual words, not people who write books and talk about from their own intuitive thing, however
right,
beautiful
right,
that might be.
right. Okay.
Um, so from that view, we know that there's something there, but there's not, we could say, well, it seems like that evolution's engine, that pattern will iterate, but we have to wait for people to take assessments that say things
Uh-huh.
that point to that.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. Yeah.
beautiful. So,
Thank
um,
you. No.
yeah, thank you so much. Here, I'll pause this here for now.